Welcome to the Clear to Send podcast, a podcast about wireless engineering, where we educate you on Wi-Fi technology, talk about design tips, troubleshooting, interviews, and the tools. Here are your hosts, Roel and Francois.
Hey everybody, welcome to a brand new episode of the Clear to Send podcast. Thank you guys for listening. We are gonna have a new episode about 6 gigahertz and what is it going to change for us. And this is coming right after WLPC, where Francois was, and Francois is here, our co-host. How are you doing, Francois?
Hey, Roa. Very good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for joining us. And I know you're not in your normal location, so for anyone that if they can hear anything differently, just forgive us there. Francois isn't he's traveling at the moment, but we're just trying to knock out some episodes here where it's fresh in our minds, talking about 6 gigahertz, a lot of good information that came from WLPC, lots of good presentations. So if we're going to link to some of those in the show notes as well. And from there, we can start talking about it. So first off, Francois, what did you think about the 6 gigahertz content from WLPC?
Yeah, it was really good. We got to hear from the vendors, which was really good. So we had David Coleman from Extreme, we had Wes Purvis from Mist, and because they work for the vendors, they actually got to test some of the APs and have some be engaging all of the discussions around 6 gigahertz. So they shared some of that information with us. So even though it's still early, like they're just starting to ship 6 gigahertz APs. Not even all countries are allowed to start broadcasting 6 gigahertz. So it's still very early in the game, but we got good information from them. And like I said, what we wanted to do today is kind of focus on the practical aspect of it and see how it's going to impact our job as a Wi-Fi engineer in the future, in the coming years. Because adding a new frequency band changes a whole bunch of stuff for us in the field, on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, exactly. And it's still very early. So if you head over to cleartosend.net/285, you will find some of the links there that we will be referring to. And because of the vendors that they have early access to this equipment and they're doing their own testing, of course it's in a lab environment, but it does give us some information into how this will impact things like design, how we do configuration, and how we even validate, right? Because there isn't equipment out there for us to do validation surveys for. So I'm sure a lot of you guys are asking, well, how am I going to make sure this works other than using an actual client device? So why don't we?
Yeah, and I would recommend. I was going to say I would recommend you guys watch the presentation from WLPC. They're very good, and you get a lot of insights from the presentation. And they actually did some real world testing. So I know Wes was talking about he spent some time at the Dartmouth College to do some real world testing inside like a classroom and inside the aesthetic center that they have. So he was sharing some of that data as well, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's actually interesting to get some real world environment. And still, there's not a ton of devices that support 6 gigahertz. I even tried to get a hold of an Intel AX211, but apparently they can't send it to me from the vendor that I got it from because the minimum quantity was 100 units. So I wasn't going to purchase 100 of those. Yeah, so I couldn't get that. So I have to figure out maybe getting another, maybe a mobile device that supports 6 gigahertz. But because I did want to see how it works, how it interacts, and also how we're going to design for it, right? So these are some of the topics we're going to talk about. It's not going to be a complete deep dive. So why don't we talk about what we think some of the design considerations should be, Francois?
Yeah, sure. So, for the design, a couple of things we have to think about. Maybe we can start with the predictive model. If you're thinking of doing a predictive model, because we're dealing with 6 gigahertz, which is a higher frequency than what we do today on 5 gigahertz. obviously we're going to have some changes in terms of the coverage that we get from the AP. So we're not going to be able to get the same type of coverage as 5 gigahertz. It's going to be slightly lower than 5 gigahertz,
Yep.
Depending on the material and all of this. You have some sort of additional loss that would have to be taken into consideration. So when we start doing our planifications, our modeling, we have to take that into account. Wes was sharing some data from some researchers that was doing tests on attenuations from different wall type materials, and his conclusion was to say that the higher the frequency, the more loss you get, except for drywall. Drywall's like kind of the same,
special,
regardless of the frequency. Yeah, drywall is special, but every other material was different. So if you have like bricks, if you have cinder blocks, if you have concrete, then you're going to see a little bit more loss in these areas. So if you're thinking of upgrading to 6 gigahertz APs, you'd have to look at your design and see if it's dense enough, because your lower covered areas will become even lower with 6 gigahertz.
Yeah, you really got to think about that coverage from 6 gigahertz. And if we go back to our CWNP training, they cover this in the CWNA. The reason for the additional loss is because of 6 gigahertz being a higher frequency than 5 gigahertz. So the attenuation is much higher there, especially with material where we get 10 dB loss already, right? So it's going to be much worse. And with 6 gigahertz, we have the 1200 megahertz we're going to use here in America. That's a lot of frequency. And the higher you go, that's just something you have to consider in your design, right? And
on top of this, you also have the free space pass loss. So if you look at the free space pass loss calculation, so just the natural loss of the signal in 6 gigahertz, you have 1-2 dB more than 5 gigahertz just to start with, without any additional loss. So wall material. So that's already there just by the simple fact that you're using a higher frequency.
Yeah, and one of the things that I haven't considered as well is the receive sensitivity of some of these devices. That's one thing that we haven't really gotten any data from in order to really see the full picture.
So as the frequency goes higher, your wavelengths goes shorter, which means that your antenna is also smaller, because the size of the antenna is related to the wavelength of the frequency you're trying to measure or capture. So if your antenna is smaller, it means that your receive aperture is smaller, which means that you receive less energy. So that can also impact, how much energy are you going to be able to capture on 6 gigahertz. It's going to impact your RSSI a little bit when you're going to measure that signal. So, all of that added up, FSPL, small antennas and all of this, it's according to the test that Wes was doing in measuring the signal strength and comparing 5 gig to 6 gigahertz, he had like a difference of, -2 to -5 dB between 5 gig and 6 gig.
Yeah. And speaking of that, it creates a difference for the device and its algorithm to try to determine what to join to, right? And I can start assuming that we'll have devices that will do interband roaming, where 6 gigahertz might sound good for the device, but then all of a sudden it goes to 5 gigahertz. So really need to plan your designs carefully and need to do a lot of testing for these devices that are tri-band devices, right? Because you want to see how these devices will select what frequency they join to depending on the coverage. So all this information is good and useful that we're seeing from WLPC. But again, we really should be testing it.
Yeah. And for the interband roaming, it's going to be a challenge because of security. Because on 6 gigahertz, Wi-Fi 6, so, AX is mandatory, which means that WPA3 is mandatory. So if you want to be able to do interband roaming, you need to deploy WPA3 on 5 gigahertz as well, because if you have WPA2 on 5 gigahertz and WPA3 on 6 gigahertz, according to the test that we're doing, it doesn't really work today. So that's another consideration we're going to have to think about is security, and how do we deal with security? How do we configure our SSID? Do we transition to WPA3? Can we do it with the devices we currently have on 5 gigahertz? So it's going to be some, like you say, a lot of trial to see what works in the enterprise space. But at the beginning, we actually might see, 6 gigahertz only SSID maybe, because we won't be able to, support everything.
Yeah, that might just be the transition plan, and guidance is setting a different SSID, and then making sure that the devices that are joining to 6 gigahertz don't actually have the other SSID in its list, and start joining to that one, and have a device jumping between SSIDs is a common thing I see even in universities, where someone just tries to join to as many SSIDs as possible just to get on the internet. But then now they're jumping between SSIDs, and then one's open, one has pre-shared key, one is .1x. It really creates this end user frustration and bad experience for the end user. And another thing to consider with the configuration, right, other than security, is also our channel configuration and channel selection of nearby APs, because in 6 gigahertz, there's a lot of channels to scan, right, depending on how you have your channel widths set up. But there is plenty of channels that a device will need to scan for. And I don't think we have a lot of information yet on how devices will do the channel scanning. But being that there's a long list of channels, we then now have to carefully plan those channels with surrounding APs. Do you think that's the case, Francois?
Yes. So I think David Coleman has published, a few blogs on the channel scanning, and they have like active scanning, passive scanning. Different things are defined in the standard for 6 gigahertz. For the channels, if we go back a little bit on we're going to have like two types of countries. We're going to have the countries that have the full 1200 megahertz of spectrum, which is, most of the Americas and other countries as well, which gives you tons of channels. It gives you 59 20 megahertz wide channels, 29 40s, and 14 80s. So it's plenty channels at 1200 megahertz of spectrum. And then you're going to have the second type of countries that only get the first band, the Uni 5 band, which gives you about 500 megahertz of spectrum. And that would be, they call it the European model, because that's what you get in Europe. You only get the first part of it. So depending on the country you're going to be in, that might impact, how you configure your channels, especially related to channel width. Because if you have 1200 megahertz of spectrum, you actually have a lot of wider channels. And they were saying during the conference that 80 megahertz would become the new default in 6 gigahertz, because you actually have more 80 megahertz wide channels on 6 gigahertz than you have 40 megahertz wide channels on 5 gigahertz. So the most vendors will just use 80 megahertz wide channels as a default configuration on 6 gigahertz. And the reason why they'll do this is because they don't have the power constraints anymore on 5 gigahertz. As you increase your channel width, the noise increases. On 6 gigahertz, they changed the way the regulation is done around transmit power, and you can actually increase your transmit power as you increase your channel width to not lose any SNR, right? So you can compensate the fact that the noise increases as you go wider by just increasing your transmit power and still provide the same level of SNR, which is great, which means we can make more efficient use of those 80 megahertz wide channels. And going back to the scanning, there's also something called the PSCs, the preferred scanning channels, which would be the new acronym. Yeah, exactly. Why not? Which would be like the channels that would be scanned primarily by the client devices as they're discovering APs on 6 gigahertz. And they were saying that according to the initial testing, if you don't have an AP on these PSC channels, it actually takes a while for the clients to discover the APs, and sometimes the clients, never discover that AP. So it makes way more sense to use those PSC channels as your channels on 6 gigahertz. And the way they've organized those PSC channels is that they have one every 4 channels. So they organize it neatly so you could use it as 80 megahertz wide channels. Maybe we can add a diagram for this. It would make more sense.
Yeah, we'll add a screenshot from one of the presentations and link to the presentation.
But so if you look at the 80 megahertz wide channels, the second 20 megahertz wide channel in that 80 megahertz block would be a PSC, and they've organized it that way. So you could actually, it would make a lot of more sense to use 80 megahertz wide channels. And they were saying that it's a good idea for vendors to use that PSC as the primary channel. So they can just send the beacons on that channel and then it can get discovered by the clients who are doing, a discovery.
Yeah, there you go. It is a lot to take in when you describe it that way, but a graphic can simplify that idea. And so we'll include that into the show notes as well.
To add just one more thing, David Coleman talked a lot about this as well, but he was saying that if you don't use the PS as your primary channel and you start using other channels, then you can introduce OBSS interferences, overlapping BSS interferences, which we've talked about in the podcast before. Remember with Devin on episode 84. I remember that episode.
Yeah, it's a good episode. If you guys haven't listened to it, I would highly recommend checking it out.
Yeah, so it's still going to be a problem in 6 gigahertz if people don't stick to PSC channels and start doing wider channels. So he did some tests and he was explaining a few things around it. But so that's another reason why it's a good idea for vendors to stick with 80 megahertz wide channels and use the PSC channel as their primary channels.
Okay. And so for a lot of these access points then that are 6 gigahertz that are coming out, there's a lot of them that have been announced this year. I think the challenge is that they're all the low power indoor access points, right? So I don't think there are any access points out with external connectors. So that becomes a challenge for environments like warehouses and stadiums or anywhere where you're using an antenna.
Yeah, so they have different, device classifications. And for now, the only, AP classification is what they call the LPI, low power indoor AP. And so these type of AP is the one that are shipping right now. They can only be used indoor with relatively lower power, right? So like you said, the specification on indoor use means that the AP cannot be weatherized, so it cannot be installed outdoor. It cannot have removable external antennas, right? And David Coleman was making a comment saying that you may have external antennas, but not removable.
Yeah,
We've never seen that, right? But like external antennas that you cannot remove or some sort, I don't know.
Like
but you cannot have fixed, yeah. So anyway, like you said, for environments where we're used to use external antennas, like warehouse or freezers or stadiums or outdoor, we won't be able to use these APs yet. And also for environments where we need higher power, when you use higher gain antennas or stadium and so on, then these APs will not be the best as well. So that could limit, some of the advantage of 6 gigahertz in some of these environments to start with because of the LPI, the low power indoor limitation that we have today on these devices. But there's another classification called a standard power mode that will come later on, which will mainly be used for outdoor. So in that standard power mode, you'll be able to use more power. You'll be able to use external antennas. You'll be able to have weatherized APs. The only drawback is that you have to comply with something called AFC, Automated Frequency Coordination, which means that you have to connect to some sort of AFC provider that checks which channels you can use in the environment, and they check against like the FCC database. So it's a little bit more advanced. The AP has to provide its GPS coordinates so they can make sure that the AP is not going to choose 6 GHz channels that actually used by incumbents in that outdoor space. And so that's what is actually complex, having some sort of AFC provider that everyone can use. And they were saying that it's not going to be before 2023 that we'll see those type of equipment.
Yeah, it hasn't been fully set up and infrastructure is not there yet. We even have an episode, episode number 218 with Chuck from Aruba, where he talks about PSD and also AFC. It's a really interesting conversation because Aruba has been highly involved in the process, so he's able to share a lot of those details. And so it looks like now 6 gigahertz will have kind of like a phase 1 and a phase 2, kind of like how we had with AC.
Yeah, and related to the low power or the low power indoor devices, we'll share a document that the FCC has published, and they detailed what it means, what low power indoor means. And they have like rules where you cannot use it outdoor, you can use it above 10,000 feet, which means you cannot have it in airplanes, pretty much. But they have those rules. And they also have a paragraph where they say that it cannot be battery powered. And Wes was making a comment about AP-NSX site survey. What does it mean?
What does that mean for
if
us?
It cannot be? Yeah. So it says the low power indoor AP must be powered by a wired connection and not by battery power. And then it says the low power indoor AP may use battery backup only during power outages. So are you going to disconnect the power while you do your AP-NSX? Is that what it means?
Does that mean predictive only? So... and I wonder why that is a rule, unless AFC, I don't know, is AFC somehow involved where it must connect back to a database?
No, I think it's to avoid, people installing them outdoor in some sort of NEMA enclosure, battery powered or, sort of powered or something like that.
Okay.
It's probably, yeah. Anyway, it's interesting. And Europe they have different regulations to low power indoor. So that's more like the indoor property of it, but then you have the low power. So what does it mean low power? Because for us, if we mean low power, like, what do you mean?
Yeah,
like,
I already use low power. Yeah. Am I have to go lower than the power I use today? A lot of times I'm using even like 10 dBm.
Yeah. So what was nice with Wes' presentation is that he came with data. So he came with the transmit power that Mist AP uses across the cloud, and he was showing that on 5 gigahertz, what we won't be able to do if we're trying to do 80 megahertz wide channels is have a transmit power higher than 13 dBm. So 13 dBm related to the mist power, which doesn't take MIMO into account. That would be the maximum transmit power you could use. And looking at the stats that he shared, that's about, I would say, maybe 75% of what is used on 5 gigahertz now. So which means that it would be nice for any environment where we don't using higher transmit power. So,
I think it'll be it should be usable in an area where it'll have some dense deployments. In some areas where they were trying to cover a larger area, a larger space, then they might have some additional APs they need to install.
Yeah, exactly. For like a low density environment, that might not be enough. But if you already have some sort of a capacity or higher capacity deployment, that should be the maximum power should be enough. But I think what we'll see is a lot of 6 gigahertz AP using the maximum power that they can use. Right? I think that's what we'll end up seeing. Because when we talk about power, we also have a limitation on the client devices. Right. So the APs have a specific device, specification categorization, but the low power indoor client also have some sort of specifications, and their transmit power is also lower than what the AP can do. So that might also impact, the type of coverage we can get from the 6 gigahertz APs.
Right. So a lot of transmit power mismatch there. So again, more testing needs to be done. Or if the tools that we use can somehow accommodate the client side and determine coverage and roaming, there's a lot to consider with 6 gigahertz now.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider, and related to the power of the low power indoor clients. There's actually a field in the frame that I don't remember which one it is. Maybe the beacon frame, but the AP can indicate to the client which type of power it needs to use to operate properly, to communicate back to the AP, which is interesting.
Okay. So another thing that comes to mind too are people who like to use mesh, because 6 gigahertz sounds like a perfect place to use mesh. But again, you're still going to be constrained to the transmit power that's specified by the AP. And so you still can't be too far from, can't have that large separation of distance between APs. But at least now there's more channels available. We could actually use 80 megahertz channel widths for mesh, or even higher. Maybe go dedicate 160 megahertz channel.
Yeah, and the mesh is interesting because they actually created a specific device classification for mesh devices or repeaters. So they have, the low power AP, they have the low power client, and they also have something called a subordinate indoor device. Yeah. And that subordinate indoor device, that's a classification for the mesh and the repeaters. And they also get the power from the AP in the same beacon frame. It's just a different information element. But it's interesting that they have a new classification for these type of devices. I'm guessing it's more for, like the home environment, maybe.
Yeah, I would see this being much larger in residential, just because mesh is used so much there that I can see 6 gigahertz just primarily being for backhaul. And then clients are served on 5 and 2.4. And then maybe we'll start seeing clients move over to 6 gigahertz. So we might see like dual 6 gigahertz wireless devices in the home, or APs in the home. One for backhaul and one to serve clients. I don't know. It'd be interesting. So yeah, there should be a specification for that. That way we don't get back into the same mess that we are in today with residential Wi-Fi.
Yes, I guess we'll see about that. I'm not sure. But yeah, you're right. It's definitely going to give us more, more spectrum, gives us more flexibility. It's just like, we've talked about like 50 different things in just half an hour. So
yeah,
it's going to be a little bit of a learning curve for us in the field, learn all of the new terms, acronyms, and all of this. And we haven't even talked about everything.
No, I mean, this is a good start, right? So I'd be interested. We're interested in what you guys think. And if you're testing it, what have you seen? Because it's one thing to hear how this should be played out. But of course, we haven't heard much from device manufacturers, so we don't actually know how it's going to play, especially with drivers and quality of those drivers. There's a lot to consider. And maybe there's something that we didn't cover. So if there's something you want to add, you can head over to the show notes, go to cleartosend.net/285 and leave a comment there. And looking forward to hearing your thoughts on 6 gigahertz and when it can become actually usable.
I'm excited to start doing some Wi-Fi 6E surveys and surveying 6 gigahertz whenever we can do that. That'd be cool.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if we can get the performance that people want out of Wi-Fi, right? All right. So that's our episode for today. I hope you guys enjoyed that one as we talk about the future of Wi-Fi and this transition. As always, it's a pleasure having you here, Francois, and recording this episode, and look forward to seeing what people think.
Thank you, Well. And if any of you guys are deploying 6 gigahertz, call us. We'll have you on the show. We can talk about it.
Sounds good. There you go. Open invitation, guys. Thank you guys for listening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.